Anselm Küsters, Karen Elzehorn, Matthew Cole, very warm welcome to Digital Markets Research Hub. I'm very grateful for the opportunity to discuss with you a topic which starts being very popular again, so to say, namely ordoliberalism as an ideology, as a philosophical strand. And obviously, as we are mainly interested in competition law and policy, we will try to look at its repercussions on this area of economic policy or constitutional policy even. I know that all three of you were very active in the past and are still obviously very active in exploring this phenomenon from different perspectives, and this kind of plurality of views, this richness of the discussion, I hope will allow us to look at the issue from different perspectives. So we all remember that ordoliberalism was very popular after the World War II, and there were many scholars who were trying to connect it with competition policy to underpin the roots of competition policy. Then it somehow went into almost ignorance and started being used almost pejoratively by people to indicate a kind of rudimentary, old-fashioned, naive maybe vision of competition policy. And now we see a very rapid revival of it. So maybe we can start with trying to recapitulate the key postulates, the key historical stages of evolution of the concept of ordoliberalism, its different incarnations. And maybe we start with providing a working definition. Karen, how about you starting with this, please?
A working definition of ordoliberalism. Well, I guess we need to make a distinction first, and that has to do with actually the three strands that are usually subsumed under the term of ordoliberalism. I don't actually like the English term, because in German, where the term was originally coined, we have three different notions for that. One is Ordoliberalismus, which would be the exact literal translation. And that, of course, is a normative point of view. That's a philosophy. That's an ethical approach. Then the second term is, of course, Ordnungspolitik, the politics of implementing some kind of social order. That would be the applied policy prescriptions that follow on the basis of a normative standpoint linked to ordoliberalism. And then, of course, you have the whole theory behind it, which is economic theory or perhaps also political and legal theory. That would be Ordnungstheorie. And that is actually something you can do without much of a normative standpoint. That is more institutional analysis, looking at the frameworks that are functional and working in different contexts. So these three levels, I think, really need to be distinguished. When we talk about ordoliberalism as a political point of view, as a normative standpoint, it has, of course, to do with safeguarding order and liberty because of ethical considerations, because the individual should have a certain amount of leeway in his daily life and actions. And for the historical founders of ordoliberalism, what was interesting and important was to fend off all kind of totalitarianism, so that people could actually not only live their own lives in economic terms, but also in ethical terms, so that they could unite with those they wanted to, that they could act freely as they should. So that's really the normative basis on which this stands. Now, if we look at Ordnungspolitik, the policy implications of the normative standpoint based on the theory that has been developed, what is interesting is that there again, a separation comes into play, and that is the separation between order policy and process policy, as they called it, as the historical ordoliberals called it. One is a policy of defining a framework for economic action for individuals by the state. And the idea is that afterwards, the state and government doesn't very much intervene into that framework. So all intervention by the public is limited to defining a framework. And then afterwards, the framework is supposed to produce its effects. So, process policy would be, if you intervene in this process as you go, trying to promote certain ends that come up in the political sphere. And ordoliberalism has been trying to fend off the process of spontaneous order from that kind of intervention, but relying on this basic framework, which needs to be well thought out. That is something, this approach about fixating a framework has been called elitist in some ways, because you need some enlightened people telling you where that comes from and what it should look like. And then afterwards it's encapsulated and shouldn't be touched upon so much. There's something to that criticism, but I think the separation between the two levels of action is important and helpful also in analytical ways. So perhaps so much for that.
Excellent. I already have a few follow-up questions, but let us move to Anselm and Matthew. Anselm, what would you like to add to this description?
I like the three elements that Karen highlighted a lot. I think it's a very useful differentiation. It's one I also use in my work, citing her many papers on this issue. And I think it's very helpful to tell audiences about the different dimensions involved in this Ordnungspolitik and Ordoliberalism. However, a problem that I frequently encountered in my work is that even if you start with such a general definition and then you go to the three dimensions, it's even more complicated than that when you want to break it down to a specific policy area, because ordoliberalism has been applied to many different fields, including, as we know, competition policy. And in this moment, when you try to translate these more general points into a very concrete definition for the purpose of competition policy, I think it gets even more tricky. When I try to look for general definitions of ordoliberalism with respect to competition policy in the literature, I often encounter several problems. So one is that they often miss this normative dimension that Karen mentioned, and I think it's quite crucial because in competition policy, we often deal with trade-offs, and it's difficult to decide between them. So many ordoliberals would favor, free competition, but they would also maybe like to protect startups and more small and medium-sized enterprises. So what to do in those instances? This is something where you often need a normative framework as well. And I think that's sometimes missing in very legal treatises on ordoliberalism. I also found that often these existing definitions lack a consideration of the school's development. Many of the three pillars have been present right from the start, but of course the precise way how they have been formulated has changed a lot during the post-war period. And that's something we need to consider as well. And then finally, I think it's also confused with neoliberalism, which in some policy fields is not that problematic, but in competition policy, where we have a lot of different liberal schools working on competition law, such as the Chicago School, for instance, I think it's important to differentiate. So what is my own take on that? In my own work, I propose a definition focused on language, on semantics. So what I basically argue is that many ordoliberals use different methods. They can even come to different conclusions working on the same cases, but what they all share is a set of common concepts and common semantics when talking about competition law cases. And that's something we can use to define ordoliberalism and ordoliberal arguments when working with a concrete case. So I think that adds another dimension to the definition that was provided by Karen.
Thank you very much, Anselm. Fascinating. Matthew.
Well, from what has been said so far, what we can work out is it's quite complicated. And unfortunately, what I can do is add further layers of complication on top of that. To a certain extent, when using the term, at least in English, it's often used when you say ordoliberalism almost as a blanket term that occasionally covers several different periods of thought as well. So you have kind of the Freiburg school, which is the very start. Then there's ordoliberalism, which is taken on by the second generation of thinkers, often referred to as people like Röpke and Rostow. But then also, because it was actually embraced politically in Germany after the war, what you end up with is the social market economy, which is an attempt to turn ordoliberal principles into the practical workings of government. And that's seen as being inspired very much by ordoliberalism, but also is at the same time somewhat different. So it's really difficult to narrow down something and just put it in a jar, as it were, and say, this is ordoliberalism. But it tends to revolve around, I'd say, thinking in orders. So the actual term ordo meaning order. So the idea of, particularly in contrast to how things were done at the time, thinking in terms of economic orders and how things are decided and run, but also what's probably the most famous association with it is the idea of a economic constitution rather than just a political constitution. The idea that you have the government setting rules for the game, if you will, of competition to play out. And I'd say that is some of the most striking elements, but reinforcing and agreeing with what's already been said. It's essentially really quite complicated because there are so many dimensions. There's so many aspects, and in a way, because of the success of ordoliberalism, in influencing so many things.
Excellent. Let us then go to the second part of this starting round, and I propose we started with you this time, Anselm, looking at the historical roots, which somehow explain, at least partially, this divergence, but still also the belonging to some common denominator of scholars and policymakers who associate themselves, or who we associate with ordoliberalism.
Yeah, sure. So as Matthew just said, the origins lie in the Freiburg School, which is called like that because it originated in the University of Freiburg in Southwest Germany. As every academic school, this also involves a lot of biographical dimensions, a lot of interaction between concrete people, concrete figures, and their trajectories. And I think Karen is more of an expert, so I would maybe omit this part here and rather focus on the intellectual history aspect of that, because I think that's a dimension that's often ignored when you look only at these concrete figures. So every academic school is, of course, situated in a very specific context in time, involving political, economic, legal dimensions. And for the Freiburg School, this is of particular importance because this is an interdisciplinary school that involves all of these dimensions, because it involves people from the bourgeoisie that are interested in many different subjects, including literature and music. So they have a very broad view on society. So everything that happens at this time is also reflected on different levels in their work and in the ideas and the language that they develop. So if I briefly go through these three dimensions, economic, legal, and political, we see that at this time in the 1920s, 1930s in Germany, many things are happening quite quickly that challenge some of the ideas and preferences that ordoliberals have, and that shapes the theory that they develop. So on the economic side, we see rising concentrations. There's a movement towards cartels and monopolies that's becoming increasingly clear. And for a long time, economists were thinking, this is just the way it is. This is like the development of stages that an economy goes through when it modernizes. And this is basically just companies exercising their freedom. And ordoliberals thought this has reached a degree at this time where it impinges the freedom of others, and we should do something about that. There's also the methodological development that they try to differentiate themselves from the historical school at the time. So the predominant economists working at that time who were less theoretical than the early ordoliberals. Then we have the legal dimensions, which is especially important for Franz Böhm, the first lawyer of the Freiburg School, because if you look at the annual conferences that the German lawyers did at the time, they are known as the German Lawyers' Days. All of the debates they had at this time were practically mirroring what the economists were saying. So they were defending this development towards cartels. They were saying this is for the common good and developing legal arguments to justify this, basically referring to the freedom of trade and the freedom of making contracts. And the most important case at this time is from 1897. Probably all German competition lawyers will know it. It's the Supreme Court, the Reichsgericht decision in the Saxon wood pulp cartel. And basically this decision justified forming a cartels for preventing ruinous competition, as it was called at the time. And it basically told cartels you can form a syndicate without having to legitimize this by providing positive effects. So what we would nowadays call like a positive net effect on welfare. And this further fueled this boom towards cartels and monopolies and concentration. And it was basically in effect until 1931. So a very influential judgment, and all the early ordoliberal texts complain basically about this judgment. So this was another reason why the school formed. And then finally, the political level, there were many problems with the Weimar Republic at this time. Ordoliberals were quite critical of this development, and they saw there was a lot of interdependencies between these political problems and the move towards economic concentrations and the lack of competition law action against it. So they realized that there are interdependencies between politics, between economics, and between law. And that's why they founded this interdisciplinary school to tackle these issues coherently from a holistic perspective.
I propose we agree. I will not be fascinating after each of your interventions. Matthew.
Yes, I mean, Anselm's covered it very well, but it is interesting to see with ordoliberalism how much of it is a resistance or a response to the problems that were happening around the time. So as Anselm said, there was a huge increase in concentration, or if you don't, in fact, I think concentration was largely encouraged. Before that, the prevalence of cartels, the fact that they were legal, all these things meant there was so much more concentration and so much less competition in the markets. And ordoliberalism is in part a resistance to this, but also on the political level, ordoliberals tend to be very wary of essentially corporate influence and lobbyist influence on government. And with the failings of the Weimar Republic, they advocated for what's often said in English as strong government, which I think can be very confusing as a term because it sounds scarily authoritarian for something which has the word liberal in it. And I think that confuses people an awful lot when they hear, wait, you're liberal, but you're advocating for strong government. And I think it's probably better to describe it as impartial government, or a government that is free from very strong lobby interests and things like this. And this, of course, was born out of the Weimar Republic. My own research that I conducted is very interesting, reading debates and discussions where Böhm in a legislative committee specifically referred to the Weimar Republic, and he said, look, during this period, this exception was only used 3 times, I think it was 3 times, and every single time it was basically in response to lobbyists, essentially. And so you can see from the time, obviously the Nazi period as well, when liberties were being taken away, so much of ordoliberalism was a resistance and a fight back against the situation as it was developing at the time. So over concentration, lack of liberty, previously weak government, and all this kind of stuff. And then we get to see that ordoliberalism is a solution or a proposed system to counterbalance that and to stop it from happening again.
Karen.
Excellent. There's not much to add to that. I think the point Matthew just made is really crucial and shows why ordoliberalism is still so interesting and should have some importance nowadays. I recently did a lengthy interview with Luigi Zengalis, whom you probably know as well. And Luigi said in this interview, we need more ordoliberalism today. And why did he say that? Well, precisely because his analysis, not only of the United States, but other countries as well, is that this intertwining of the economic and the political realm is is having such dangerous effects and has progressed so much that it's hard actually to cure it. When you look at the US and how the political system is dominated by big conglomerates, it's really gruesome. How election processes are influenced by industry, etc. This is actually something at a much bigger scale than what was the case in Germany when the ordoliberalism came into existence. But it's exactly the point they were making, disentangling the political and the economic sphere. That is really what matters. And I think we can use that perspective now. That's what makes it so timely, even today. Of course, the scale is different and the context is different, and it will never be possible to really do this according to the textbook. But I think the first step is really to become aware of the problem and to try and counterbalance it. And reform is always a political thing to do, to decide upon, to implement afterwards, and it may be difficult. But the first step, of course, is to talk about it and to sort of raise awareness. And that we can do on the basis of the history of thought, and when we talk about what happened, 100 years ago, basically. This started after the First World War, as all these discontents with the Weimar Republic came up in Germany, and in many ways we find ourselves in similar situations now, I think.
Thank you very much, Karen. And it gives us a nice opportunity to salute the work which Luigi Dengalis and Stifler Center are doing, pioneering work in so many respects, and their podcast Capital is also worth noting, of course. But it also gives us a nice opportunity to revert to the third round of our conversation, namely after we scrutinize the foundational layer of ordoliberalism, to look at its impact on competition, on EU competition policy and EU member states competition policy. So I propose we start this round with Matthew, Karen, and then Anselm.
So talking about the influence of ordoliberalism on EU competition law, yes? Yeah, so in this respect, I mean, for a while, in English at least, the authoritative kind of text on this was by David Gerber, and he set out, I think it was back in about 1995 or 1998, he was explaining how ordoliberalism was a major influence on EU competition law. And for a while, that was just taken as gospel to a certain extent, and we didn't have much of a debate. But about 10 years later, Professor Ackman then published some work looking at the original documents in the preparation of the Treaty of Rome. And her conclusion was actually very different. Her conclusion was there was some ordoliberal influence, but it was really overstated, and we basically completely overestimated how much of it was in there. So for a while, we had two very polar kind of opposite sources or pieces of evidence. And so hopefully this is where my most recent research steps into it, because I thought it would be really interesting to look at what wasn't particularly controversial at the time, which was the idea that ordoliberalism influenced the GBB, the Gesetz gegen Wettbewerbsbeschränkungen 1957 in Germany. And most people accepted that ordoliberalism was a powerful influence in Germany. So I went back and I had a look at the committee that drafted that act to see, okay, is it true that ordoliberalism actually had a great influence even on the German competition law? And if it did, what were the discussions being raised? What were the arguments being raised, and why were they being raised? Because the interesting thing is the GBB and the Treaty of Rome, the Articles on Competition, were actually being drafted around the same time. So it wasn't any point in the Germans producing a competition law act, which then completely contradicted what was put into the Treaty of Rome, because they're going to have to try and settle them together. So they were being drafted at roughly the same time. And so this provides a very interesting insight as to what exactly the ordoliberals were arguing at the time, because the wonderful thing is this committee was actually headed by Franz Böhm, who was, of course, a founding member of the Freiburg School. So it's very difficult to get a better source of representation of what the ordoliberals believed. There was also ordoliberal politicians who got involved in the process, such as Erhard and Müller-Armack, and they were quoted in the documents as well. And so we have this very direct source as to what the ordoliberals believed, and it allows us to reevaluate the sources that already exist. because some of the arguments that are put forward are premised on ordoliberals believing in a particular thing. So probably the most obvious one was the idea that ordoliberals think that monopolies essentially should be prohibited. That was something which has been argued previously. The interesting thing is the committee documents for the GVB don't really show that at all. And so there's a number of things that it seems that we've misinterpreted, or in some instances, I think the real issue is that we haven't noticed the change from what ordoliberals thought perhaps 10 years before the Treaty of Rome to what they thought at the time that the Treaty of Rome and the GVB were being negotiated. And so we see that actually there's no reason to disbelieve the argument that ordoliberals did influence EU competition law. If I can kind of bring it to a quick summary, the arguments that they're making seem to be coherent with what turned up in the Treaty of Rome. And really what I think the research kind of points to is that we need a better understanding of ordoliberalism if we're really going to understand how much it's influenced EU competition law. Because if you don't really know what you're comparing it to, it's very difficult to decide whether it's influenced the law as it stands. Hopefully that makes sense.
It does, absolutely. And I'm sure we will have other opportunities to continue with this topic, inviting these scholars which you have mentioned in particular, but also other peers who deal with this legacy. Karen, if I can revert to you and maybe ask your focus and your expertise in understanding and interpreting ordoliberalism is wider than competition policy sensu stricto. Maybe you observe some good examples of how it influenced other policies so that we in competition bubble can learn from it, or maybe learn what not to do, etc. Or providing us this broader comparative maybe perspective, or just commenting on how the ideological approach can actually influence policy making.
Well, as a framework, as a basic distinction between government intervention into economic processes and, well, sort of trying to limit that to a minimum, and this emphasis on defining the broader framework, that is really something that's a mode of thought that was very popular in Germany for many, many years. And it seems to be a little bit sort of ingrained in our DNA, the idea that that is something to consider, to think about, and to think twice when policy does not directly tackle the framework level, but tries to intervene in the process. So I would say that this way of thinking has been influential ever since World War II, to a bigger or lesser extent, depending on political preferences, of course. And my experience with it, I've lived in Berlin for quite a while and was very, very busy in the political arena as well, advising all kinds of associations and politicians, etc. And my experience from that time is that the term Ordnungspolitik is much used, and people tend to understand very different things under it. So either they're politically standing on the, well, free market, liberal, right-hand side of the spectrum, and then they more or less know what the term should mean when we think back to the founders in the 30s and 40s. But others use the term as well, and they tend to use it for something where you use politics to influence market results in a certain way. And then the process becomes defined by the result that you want to see, and you think about the policies needed to bring about that result. People who think like that are either politicians more from the left-hand side of the political spectrum, but also business people, employers associations, etc. They all tend to think that, well, we must order the market and the market result in a way exactly, and in fact to give us maximum leeway. And that is precisely not the meaning of the term, and that is not the meaning of the whole idea. The idea is really to produce a framework that is conducive to growth and welfare and liberty for all the individuals. And some of these individuals will be business people, but other individuals will just be consumers, civil society, institutions, and whatever. And that they tend sort of not to look at. So there's some confusion about the meaning of the term and what it stands for, what it allows for. But it's very much used. And those people who have a little bit more of an understanding what it really means, it should mean, they do what I said earlier. They tend to question political measures, all kinds of political policy propositions by this standard, whether it will help spontaneous interaction produce its good results, or whether it is sort of short-sighted, whether it sort of tries to circumvent this spontaneous interaction and bring about something which may, however, have side effects that we perhaps cannot even see yet and not make a prognosis for. And that's something that divides political parties pretty much. Some will say we need to act now, and this a certain policy will bring about the result that we want, and others say no, that's dangerous, we might see second side effects, and that's something we should avoid. So think back to ordoliberalism and know that we should design frameworks, and frameworks, be it in actually all economically relevant areas of policy making, so that the spontaneous effects can play themselves out.
I think I can connect it. It goes back to what Matthew said, that you have to look at the changing perceptions of this general framework after the World War, when the treaties were negotiated and EU competition policy had its inception. But I think the crucial point here to make is that these were not extremists. They were also practical, and they adapted this framework to the challenges of the time. So concretely, what does this mean for European competition policy? I think after the war, the focus on monopolies that's maybe there in the initial articles quickly supersedes. They are confronted with this idea of European integration, and they have to see what will be if this happens, what will be ordoliberal priorities in this process. And one of my interesting findings that I had when I conducted my PhD research is that actually when the Commission started enforcing the rules from the Treaty of Rome that Matthew described earlier, they initially focused a lot on vertical restraints, not so much on monopolies and abuse of dominance. That came only later. And some observers have argued, oh, you see, this means that actually there is no ordoliberal influence at all, because ordoliberals, they are just caring about monopolies, preventing them in the first place. And initially the Treaty of Rome, there was not even some form of merger control. But in fact, when you deal with the contemporary writings of the Freiburg School, as for instance, published in the Ordo yearbook, which is like a volume that the Freiburg School publishes each year, containing articles about many different policy areas, including competition policy, you see that they were very much concerned about vertical restraints, because they were thinking, okay, if we get this European common internal market here, what will be the main problems for this? And this was in the beginning vertical restraints, not monopolies. So the initial case law was very much in line with the preferences of contemporary ordoliberals. Another example would be Mestmecker, who was a student of Böhm and is therefore belonging to the second generation of ordoliberals. At the time, he became advisor to the Commission, and he himself also favored this initial focus on vertical restraints, and he clearly expressed as it is in his writings. So I think this shows, again, that we have to look at the specific points in time where we want to make this comparison of the framework to the policy level. And it shows, again, that we have to look at the development of ordoliberalism. And then finally, we also have to consider the development of EU competition policy as such. So I would argue that after this initial period of ordoliberal influence, eventually this stopped in the early 2000s with the more economic approach. And it's then just in the last couple of years that we might see a re-ordoliberalization of EU competition policy. So on all different kinds of layers, we have to consider the historical dimension, the progress of time. And I think that's my point as an historian to emphasize.
I think in such a situation, it's really important to start off by thinking of intervention in two different ways. So you can have a sense of intervention, which is very much the government directing what they think the economy should do. So, for example, if the government thinks there should be more investment in, nuclear power, or the government thinks that it wants to pick winners or to create national champions or things like that, that is a type of intervention. I don't think that is the type of intervention that ordoliberals are interested in whatsoever, right? If we think of that of more a dirigist kind of statist kind of direct, should we say direct intervention in the economy, I don't think ordoliberals have any interest in that whatsoever. They are more interventionist compared to a laissez-faire kind of attitude of, you just take your hands off the wheel, you let the market run, and it will just do everything on its own. So yes, the ordoliberals are more interventionist in that. But the thing to really keep in mind is how they're interventionist. Okay, so how does an ordoliberal want the government to be involved in the economy? Well, it's very much about setting the rules rather than picking the winners. So the easiest way to try and explain this really is to use a sports metaphor. If you think of a football game or a rugby game, you have the different teams, and if they are different companies, they're all competing to win. What you do not want from an ordoliberal perspective is someone to come along and try and pick the winning team, to look at them and think, oh, who's doing well? We think this team's doing well, so we'll try and help them out and get them to win. That is completely not what ordoliberals are about. It's a form of intervention, but it's not what it's about. To keep the sports metaphor, if competition policy is the rules of the game, what the government should be is almost like a referee. It needs to be impartial. The rules need to be set beforehand, and they just apply the rules to ensure that whoever is the best team actually wins out. That is more interventionist than laissez-faire. If you compare it to just the idea of, right, we'll keep property rights, we'll have criminal law, we'll have those sorts of things, and we'll protect that. But apart from that, we stand off and we let the market do what it wants. Okay, it is more interventionist than that. But what you're trying to do is to ensure that freedom is preserved, that liberal aspect, the freedom is preserved as much as possible. And ironically, sometimes that takes rules even in very classical liberalism. If we think of Adam Smith, for example, it would have been absurd to go up to Adam Smith, if you could at the time, and say, well, look at these rules about property and ownership. Surely that's too much intervention. If I go over and steal your, let's say I steal your car or something like that, the government comes along and intervenes and stops me from doing it. Obviously, that would be an absurd argument. No one would make that. No one would think that, the classical liberalism would mean that you don't have the enforcement of contracts or the police or anything like that. What ordoliberalism does is takes a step further than that and recognizes that it's not only the state that can interfere with my liberty. It's not just the state that can interfere with my liberty. It's also dominant corporations. It's also cartels and things like that. And so it becomes interventionist, if you want to use that term, to protect the rules of the game, to allow people to continue to fairly compete. And so, like I say, it's odd because it can sound more interventionist, and it is compared to, like I say, some very libertarian viewpoints, but you're only intervening to allow people to continue to exercise their freedom. So if every market was covered by non-competes or exclusivity contracts, I would lose my freedom to enter the market, and suppliers would lose their freedom who they can supply. It would all be too tied up. And so what ordoliberalism does is, like I say, it does intervene, but merely to protect those rules and to keep the competitive market functioning.
Thank you very much, Matthew. Karen, what are your reflections on this? I know you've been doing research on populism. And now we see that this term is kind of susceptible to being used excessively, maybe, or trying to cover all enthusiasm of greater role of the public in regulating, in micromanagerial role of the public in regulating economic processes, which is essentially, to some extent, it is, as Matthew highlighted to us, it's part of the conception or at least a conception of ordoliberalism, or at least it's not incompatible with some of the versions of it, but at the same time we cannot use it indiscriminately, of course, for populistic purposes, to somehow to use very respectful policy and vision to somehow to justify pretty much every instance of intervention. So how do you connect this term with your research on populism?
Again, that's a very difficult question, and I'll try to do it one by one. First of all, I mentioned some criticisms of ordoliberalism earlier, and I'll tie up with that. One of the arguments is that it's a little bit of an elitist approach, because this the framework, the rules of the game, need to be decided upon by enlightened people. So these may be scholars, but these may be politicians as well. And as I said, there is something to that. Now the problem is, if you don't do that, and if you criticize that approach, that science is somehow supposed to help the construction of good rules, what have you got? What is left? And what these people in the current debate are saying, political scientists mainly, is that, well, the solution is well, letting plurality play itself out. Pluralism is a good thing, and the actors in the plural game of society are parties, are in this industry, are business associations, are trade unions, are all these institutions, and in their haggle and in their struggle, something will take shape that will reflect the various differing interests in society, and we should not circumvent that. That is something that is an expression of liberty. I find that argument very interesting, but I think that if we do that, we land exactly in the situation where people were in the 30s, and where they thought, well, this is just going the wrong way. And it is something that gives populist leaders a lot of leeway. If ordoliberalism is really about checks and balances in the economic sphere, but also in the political sphere. And if you deny the necessity to have checks and balances, I think you just haven't understood your politics right. Checks and balances are there to protect the individual's freedom in all spheres of social life. And of course, in order to agree on rules, we cannot go and ask everybody every day. That is something that is not feasible. But we have a legitimacy of constitutions. We have a legitimacy of political action through the democratic setups that we have in most countries of the Western world. And it's so important to protect them. If we don't do that, and that's what we see with the populist movements that have come up in the recent decades, I must say, unfortunately, is that they start by attacking these checks and balances. We are currently watching what's happening in Israel, something that one couldn't believe would ever happen. But we've also seen it in Poland. We've seen it in Hungary. Institutions are not necessarily stable unless civil society, politicians, and political parties support them. And that's really crucial. So I think ordoliberals have 100 years ago, they have understood something that is very important, and we're sort of losing track of it, and we can watch the results in the political arena every day. So that's something I find very worrisome.
Ansel, how would you comment on this relationship? Because I think Matthew and Karen have highlighted or offered the expositions of ordoliberalism and its kind of position within the spectrum of non-interventionism, hands-off approach on the utmost right, and kind of planned economy, etatism at the most left, more or less in consensus with each other, with maybe micro differences, with Matthew appearing to be more neutral, or kind of promoting more kind of still rather hands-off approach, kind of institutional setting, referee, the rules of the game are equal for everybody. Whereas if I understand correctly from interpreting Karen's contribution, I think her views is that you need greater discretion in some cases, and which is a double-edged sword. So what would be your view, Anselm, on this process? And I know you also did the research on lobbying, so maybe you can connect it with this issue as well.
Yeah, sure. In general, I like sports metaphors and football metaphors, so I'm always for the referee. That's fine by me. But I would like to make a point on this spectrum between laissez-faire and interventionism, where to place ordoliberalism, and I would also like to connect it to your initial question, what this moment of EU competition law reform means in our present day. So is this a move towards more ordoliberalism or not? And the quote I would like to bring is from Walter Eucken. It's one of my favorite sentences. He once wrote that it's not about the quantity of state interventions, it's about the quality of those interventions. And I think that's very helpful to reflect on, because if we talk about interventionism, we often think about this very simple scale where you can just have more or less. But the actual ordoliberal insight is that it's also about the quality. And I think that's very important when thinking about the current reforms. So what do I mean with this? As I alluded to earlier, the initial competition law rules, they didn't include merger control, as you know. But still, commission officials and ordoliberal experts that were hired at this time found a way, to use what is nowadays Article 102 to still prosecute some cases. And that shows that a framework, a rule framework that's not very ordoliberal per se, can still be used for ordoliberal means. So if we look today at the Digital Markets Act, the DSA, all the reforms now, the guidelines about Article 102, there's a lot going on with these rules, but it's only on a superficial level that you would say, maybe this is very ordoliberal because it's against economic power. But to really judge this, what is the quality of this, we have to see how it will be implemented. I think that's the key. In the end, it depends on the people. Is it applied in a very discretionary fashion, or do they find meaningful ways to do this rule-based? Do they use it for protectionist means? Will they only target US companies, or is there actually also some efforts to address problems that we have in Europe, in our common market as well? I think these will be crucial questions to really decide at the end, from an academic perspective, how much ordoliberal quality was in these reforms. I would say on a superficial level, this goes in the direction of more ordoliberalism, but I think the devil is in the detail, and we have to wait for the concrete implementation in the coming months and years.
I think it's important to remember a certain amount of the context of how the DMA is, the digital markets response is coming about. And obviously, agreeing with what Anselm said, we'll see whether it's a framework which sets out the rules, which are clear and applied in a fair and impartial way, or whether it allows far too much discretion and starts to be used in an arbitrary way. And obviously, if it is, that wouldn't be ordoliberal. But I think it's also useful to think about the changes which have occurred in Article 102 and how that's applied in the last perhaps 2 decades, which perhaps makes it necessary to bring out further legislation. So the way that the competition law is now seeking a more economic approach, as it's called, I personally would disagree with such terminology and say it's a more Chicago economic approach, but not necessarily a more economic approach. The difficulty with this is you have a balance that everyone is trying to fix in competition law, essentially. You want the law to be predictable and certain. You don't want it to be arbitrary. You want it to be economically precise so that it only targets genuine anti-competitive conduct, but you need it to be administrable and effective. And the difficulty is the approach that we're taking, which, like I say, I would refer to as a more Chicago approach with Article 102, the difficulty is that it's so nuanced and there's so much requirements for enormous amounts of economic data, which can be interpreted in different ways. It's made the whole application of Article 102 a lot more complicated, a lot more time intensive. And so what we have is, to take a relatively simple case with the Intel decision, the actual problems which caused the Intel decision, the actual behavior, happened around, I think it's about 20 years ago now. It might be a little bit more. So essentially, without revealing too much about my age, I was still in school discussing with my friends the computer chips, which are the subject of the Intel decision. And we still do not have a conclusion on the Intel decision. It's been decades and we still don't have anything. Now, that's not even particularly complicated. It's to do with conditional rebates and things like that. And we still haven't sorted it out. That's a real problem. And so when you think of things which become much more complicated in terms of network effects and the kind of dynamic competition and things like that, things that you'd associate with maybe Facebook or Google, and all these sorts of things which are linking together. Unfortunately, the direction we've gone in this more Chicago school approach just makes it extremely difficult, I think, to get cases decided, get behavior changed, and to actually implement the law. And I wonder whether this change away from ordoliberalism in Article 102 has now resulted in a situation where we're having to bring in a patch, a stick-in plaster, as it were, to try and solve these problems. Because if it's taken over 20 years to get a simple conditional rebates case through the courts, then something's wrong. And unfortunately, people are having to respond, I think, to that failure.
So thank you very much for this really insightful and impactful contributions. I really enjoyed learning from you, and I will continue kind of scrutinizing your ideas further. And as the tradition goes, we ask the contributors to provide recommendations to students who find themselves very perplexed, or many at least, with many opportunities and also challenges. So Karen, what would be your kind of recommendation for younger generation?
Oh, well, when it comes to reading, there's so much out there. First of all, perhaps it would be useful to discover the original writings, especially by Walter Eucken. Now, I know that there's a problem, and that is that his book, that is the most easily understandable one, and the one that really lends itself to policy analysis, has not been translated into English yet. It's called Grundsätze der Wirtschaftspolitik, Principles of Economic Policy. And I don't give up hoping that someone will someday come up with the money to fund our translating it. So, but for those who speak German and read German, I really recommend it. It has 2 chapters in it where he defines the basic tenets of a competitive order. And I think that's really helpful for us nowadays. Because the crucial point is, of course, that the price mechanism can work, and he explains the channels through which this runs and through which this must be kept up. So even when you look at competition policy for him is not something that has a value in itself. It has its value and its purpose in protecting the price mechanism and the signals that are formed this way. And that is actually the criterion also to use for evaluating competition laws passed by the EU. Does that help the price mechanism, or does it not? Does it just make things more complicated? So read Eucken, then of course read Adam Smith. That's always something I would recommend. And yeah, perhaps the third one would be look at the Ordo yearbook that was mentioned by Anselm earlier. It still exists, and more articles are being published in English as well. So that should be accessible for people around the world. And this is really most of the time young research by people who try to take the ordoliberal tradition further. And I really recommend that.
Thank you very much, Karen. Anselm.
Yes, I can only strengthen Karen's argument. I think it's really interesting to go back to the sources. If you are a student and you think something has to change now in the world of competition law, the consumer welfare standard is too narrow, we need a more holistic, a broader perspective. You don't have to develop the wheel from scratch. It's always fascinating to go back in time, read older scholars, what they have written. And I think for many of the problems we face, it's interesting to go back to the initial ordoliberal writings that Karen described, that fortunately are now available partly, at least in translation, collected volumes. So it might provide conceptual inspiration for doing own research projects on the intersection of democracy and competition law. And my second suggestion would be to go abroad. If possible, do a term abroad, study somewhere else, meet friends from other countries. For me personally, this has been super valuable in thinking about what makes ordoliberalism really distinctive, and to see how people use the same words, the same concepts, but understand them differently. They associate them with different meanings, and they have different normative conceptions that are evoked by language as such. And I think going abroad helps to realize that, to broaden the horizon. And this ultimately is really important if we want to find common ground in Europe nowadays. I think we have to start with language and by engaging with other cultures and other identities.
Thank you very much, Anselm. Matthew.
Well, I agree with what's been said before. I'll probably add some more generic kind of advice for students, any kind of student who's looking for success. But in my experience, students tend to break down into two different groups. You've got one group which tends to think they're amazing and probably don't put in enough effort and are a bit complacent. And to them, my advice would simply be, there is no replacement for hard work. There isn't one. It doesn't matter how gifted you are or how intelligent you are. At the end of the day, if you do not work hard, you're just not going to get anywhere. To the other group, they're actually, I tend to find, the most hardworking, but the least self-assured, and the ones who are a bit too nervous and maybe a bit too stressed, when actually they're usually doing okay. And to them, I'd say, don't worry about the outcomes. I would just say, just remember you've got a set of God-given talents and just work as hard as you reasonably can. That means taking breaks and weekends and having rest as well. Just work as hard as you can and be happy with what you've done at the end of the day. Don't try and compare yourself to other people. Don't try and think, I have to obtain this, otherwise my life's going to end. Just remember that actually, if you're doing the best you can with the talents you've been given, you are doing what you need to, and leave the rest go, sort of thing.
Thank you very much, Matthew. Karen Ilse Horn, Anselm Küsters, Matthew Cole, thank you very much for sharing your fascinating ideas with us.